The pandemic, well, it's put the spotlight on the outsized economic burden that women are carrying, whether it's increased childcare responsibility or job insecurity, fueling worry that COVID-19 is undoing decades of advancement. But just how much progress have women made towards, well, equal participation? The World Bank has a new Women, Businesses and the Law database to capture inequality in legislation throughout the duration of a woman's working life, from the time she can enter the labour force through retirement. Bloomberg's Scarlet is standing by with, well, that author of the report. Scarlet.
Thank you, Caroline. In today's Bloomberg Equality, our ongoing conversation about the bottom line impact of diversity, I want to welcome Pinelopi Goldberg. She is professor of economics at Yale University and non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Penny, it's great to speak with you. This database tracks legislation that, as Caroline mentioned, affects each stage of a woman's working life, starting with her freedom of movement and ability to get a job through pay to finally pensions. And it does this over a 50-year period. What were you most surprised by when it came to the findings?
Hello. Hi, Scarlet. It's great to be here. There's some things we're not surprised by. As you would expect, advanced countries, richer countries, tend to have more equality. What was surprising to us is that this was not always the case. So if you look at what the situation was 50 years ago, then countries in Europe, OECD countries, looked approximately the same as developing countries in terms of how they treated women. So all the progress has been made within a few years, within a few decades. And the positive message of this insight is that things can change, and they can change fast. The other surprising finding was many of us are under the impression these days that women have made huge progress, and I think they have. But there are certain areas where we still see huge discrepancies, and one of these areas is equal pay. So this is one of the most unequal areas. And when I'm talking about inequality here, keep in mind this is inequality by the law. So we are not talking about practice. Practice is probably even worse. But even legally, in most countries, there are no provisions that make sure that women get paid equally as men. And of course, the other area is parenthood, how women are treated once they have children. Again, we see huge inequalities there.
So, Penny, I want to touch on that because I think of how countries like Japan, which of course wants to address this labor shortage, has been pushing for more women to enter the workforce. And this leads to laws that guarantee women the access and the ability to work, but it doesn't address the pay inequity, as you mentioned. Why is that? Why do they stop short of that?
This is a very good question. In fact, we do find that in the area of labor force participation, there is more equity across the world. And if you want, one cynical interpretation of this is that when countries need women, when there are labor shortages, then they are very eager to incorporate them into the labor force. So they take the necessary steps to make sure that women can work. And this involves changing laws that restrict the freedom of movement of women or the ability to get a job in any industry. But once this is achieved, there is less interest in making sure that women receive equal pay as men. Or when it comes to maternity leave, once women have children and they're perceived as being less productive, then again, very few countries take steps to make sure that women can stay at the job and get paid well.
Penny, I want to touch on that because women, as you mentioned, suffer the motherhood penalty oftentimes throughout their career and all the way through their pensions. Explain how that shows up in their pension benefits, because this is key.
Oh, this is very interesting. So most people don't think of this, but in many countries, there is a mandatory retirement age. And this mandatory retirement age differs between men and women, and typically it is earlier for women. So some people think this is actually a nice thing, women can retire earlier, but the fact of what this means is that women often cannot rise to the highest levels of the hierarchy, especially in jobs and in settings where seniority matters. So, for example, if you're in government or in the private sector and you're rising through the hierarchy, then suppose you have children and you take some time off, then that may set you back for a few years. And then when women, often when they come at a point when they can rise to the next stage and assume managerial roles, big jobs, at that point they're often forced to retire. So that prevents women from advancing professionally.
Yeah, at a time when women we know have longer life expectancy than men as well. Very quickly here, Penny, in 30 seconds, how do you envision policymakers use this database to advance women's economic equality?
So in two ways. So one way is advocacy. So by showing how women are treated in many countries, we provide an incentive to policymakers to change things, to undertake reforms, to make laws more equal. And the second use that we see for this database is research. So we can examine how laws actually affect women's empowerment, how they affect labor force participation, how they affect the wage gap, and so on.